All right, guys, so here we are back with our philosophy of religion discussion, and we're going to continue on with our classical arguments for the existence of God, right? So let me get this off the screen for us. All right, bring me back up. All right, so here we are with our introduction, right, to some of these classical arguments for the existence of God. And so just to say again, just to reiterate, um, a lot of the popular arguments, we're not necessarily going to discuss. Again, I'm leaving those to a something like a what would can be considered to be a normal uh, apologetics type course. So, like your Kalam, cosmological argument, moral argument, those things, right? Even though you easily can include those within your philosophy of religion survey or course. But the arguments that we're going to survey are going to be these classical arguments. So today we're up to the Thomistic arguments. And you notice that I've put this S here, right? This parenthetically, because we're going to give a Thomistic argument, right, in the vein of Thomas Aquinas, but at the same time, we're going to look at this from a couple different angles, because even though these arguments will be, or even though they're different, they're going to be really almost a way to kind of spin or say or explain or extrapolate on the same kind of argument. But that'll become clear as we go through this particular topic here. Now, obviously, Thomas Aquinas, what we would consider to be a medieval, theistic, specifically Christian philosopher. It's going to be roughly in the 1300s or so AD. Just an astute thinker in and of himself, in his own right. He wrote all sorts of works. He wrote, obviously, the most famous, right, would be depending on how you want to pronounce this. I've heard it pronounced Summa Theologica, Summa Theologia, all sorts of ways. But that's his most famous work, right? But he also writes, and he goes into more detail. A lot of people don't realize, in regard to these particular God arguments, a text called Summa Contra Gentiles, right, which would be basically contra the Gentiles, right? So that work is actually what contains the in-depth argument that you would find regarding these Thomistic types of versions. So, for instance, in the Summa Theologia, we've got Thomas basically just putting out little summaries of the arguments. He's already assuming that the reader of that particular work is already readily familiar with those arguments and those other philosophical works that he mentions. A lot of times people make the mistake, even philosophy instructors make the mistake that those are the robust formulation of those arguments, and they're just absolutely not. Those weren't even meant to be the arguments properly given. Those were just meant to be summaries of the arguments. You can find the substantial forms of those arguments in other works, one being Summa Contra Gentiles there. Now, again, I want to remark, I know I've hit on this every single time, but I really want to remark that this whole aspect, all of these classical arguments, are not going to be dependent upon scientific observation or inquiry. They're not going to be dependent upon scientific methodology or what's the word? What is the way I can put this? Again, they're not going to depend upon the latest scientific development. Well, why is that? Again, please let me reiterate this. Because the scientific discipline itself, right, the discipline of science, right, scientific methodology is going to presuppose or assume so many of these metaphysical principles, so many of these logical type principles that these arguments employ that are independent of, again, scientific inquiry. In fact, if some of these axioms that we're looking at, right, that we're going through in these classical arguments, like the law of causality, law of non-contradiction, the belief that change is a real feature of the world. Science it already presupposes all of these metaphysical principles, these metaphysical axioms. So it'll never be, literally in principle, these arguments just don't depend on scientific inquiry. Now, I want to also point out that in this particular lecture, these Thomistic arguments, right, that we're going to look at a couple different formulations, right? We're going to look at Ed Feser, right, the philosopher Ed Feser out of California, that we've already mentioned. We're going to follow one of his templates, look at that. But we're also going to look at two other individuals. One you may know of, right? Christian thinker Geisler, right? We're going to look at one of his breakdowns of that. But we're also going to look at, and you may be looking at the PowerPoint here at the bottom. I'll go ahead and get down to this. I'm going to skip down to it. Is that we're going to look at, and this particular philosopher, let's see, he's actually working on his PhD right now, I believe, it's in the UK. I think it's University of Reading, I believe. Anyway, doing it under David Oderberg, if you're familiar with classical philosophy, or if you're familiar with philosophy of religion, David Oderberg there. But a guy named Timothy Sowell. And so, in fact, if you've got another course, you may have seen our interview with Timothy there. But we're going to look at one of his formulations of this argument. And again, they're really just the same argument, just looked at from different angles. I want to make that clear. But we're going to kind of look at those. Now, the Feser argument is going to concentrate on, again, all of these touch on this, all of these talk about this, but again, they're concentrating, they're saying it differently. But Feser's argument is going to talk about the difference between a thing's essence, what a thing is, and a thing's existence, that it is. So all of these arguments are essentially going to point out the fact that just because you are a certain type of thing, let me say it this way. Because you are a certain kind of thing, that may or may not entail that you have to exist at all, right? And that'll become clear as we talk about it. Now, Sal's version of this, he's the guy that's currently at Grantham University there. His version is just going to really talk about dependent and contingent beings, right? Things that are just going to center around that notion about things that are dependent upon something else for their existence, contingent upon something for their existence. Again, it's roughly the same argument as the above there with Feser that you see, but it's going to say it a different way. And Geisler, we're going to look at his version, again, which would talk about dependent, contingent beings, essence, and existence. But we're going to look at how he specifically forms that or breaks that down into logical categories. Again, these are all Thomistic, and it could be said that they're simply variations on the exact same Thomistic version of an argument here. Now, I included in the PowerPoint here Sal's version of this argument. And this version was just given to me personally by him, and he gave this to me himself. So don't think that this is original with me in that sense. And really, it's not original to him either, right? I mean, it's just a version of this classical argument. But it may have been more beneficial for me to go ahead and look down to this Feser aspect. But I think that I want to stick with this original template here, because I think that you may not be as familiar with terms like essence and existence when it comes to metaphysics. So I think talking about it this way first may actually help you to understand the heart of the argument when we say that it's about essence and existence, these metaphysical topics, these metaphysical categories of being, right? So let's look at this argument as outlined here first, and then we'll go through and look at each of the premises. So first, there are dependent beings, and dependent, we can even say something like contingent, things that are dependent upon something for their existence, right? If something is a dependent being, then its continued existence must be sustained by something else. And that may be that's going to be probably the tricky premise here that we need to come back and look at. If a dependent being is sustained by something else, then either the chain of sustained beings regresses infinitely or terminates in an independent being that is not itself sustained. The chain of sustained beings cannot regress infinitely. That would be, again, as we've mentioned before, on pain of infinite regress, right? To put it in philosophical, popular philosophical jargon there. Therefore, the chain of sustained beings must terminate in an independent being that is not itself sustained. Now, it may look like, on initial observation, that this is from just a cursory look at this. It may look like what we're saying is basically just the Kalam cosmological. It may look like what we're just looking at is maybe just what we're explaining is the Kalam argument, right? The Kalam cosmological argument that, well, hey, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. This is substantially different from that type of argument. It's going to be different because this is going to talk about the nature of things in and of themselves. And it's going to be different because the Kalam argument deals with what we would call a linear cause and effect relationship. This argument is going to look at a hierarchical, right? So the first would be what's sometimes called a causal series per accidens, right? And this argument would look at a causal series per se, right? And you may be thinking, what on earth does that mean, right? So the causal series per se, or as the Kalam cosmological argument would say, is, well, this cause depends on that cause, which may or may not be here anymore. This cause depends on this cause, which may or may not be here anymore. This cause depends on this cause. So it'd be something like thinking about the birth of a child, right? So the child's existence is literally caused by the parents of the child, but the parents may pass away, right? They may be gone, yet the effect still remain. The cause may still remain, namely the child, right? That would be a causal series per se, or excuse me, causal series per accidents. That would be a linear cause. A hierarchical cause would be something like this link of the chain is hanging on this link, and the only reason it can hang now is because it's hanging on this link, which is hanging on this link, which is hanging on this link. So if one of the links goes, the whole chain goes, right? It completely falls. It's not as if this chain can hang even if you take this one out. This one's dependent upon this one to hang, but if I take this one out, well, this one can still hang. No, if this one goes, it all goes all together, right? This goes back to again, when we think about the Aristotelian notion of the first argument that we looked at, the Aristotelian argument. This, again, is arguing, as all of these arguments that we've talked about thus far, they argue for the hierarchical, right? The hierarchical or the causal series per se, that if one aspect of the cause goes and the chain of events goes, then they all go. Again, so you can think of like gears, right, on a watch. So it's not as if you spin this gear, this one will keep going. Is if if there's one not initially spinning that gets all of these spinning, which if you stop one, they all stop, right? They either go together or they go none, right, at all. Again, think back to the composer, right? He's singing the song, he's doing the performer, I should say. If he's performing the song, if he's singing the song, if I'm playing my guitar over here, if I stop, the music stops, period, right? They go together. So, having said that, let's look at this argument first. Let's go back to these premises. There are dependent beings. Now, I know this seems controversial. This, in fact, should be the least controversial of any of the premises, right? It seems like that there are things that do exist that their existence cannot be explained in and of themselves. They can't. The fact that this contraption here, right, cannot exist in and of itself. It literally cannot account for its own existence. It is dependent upon, it is contingent upon something else for its existence. So I'm pulling up a pen here. This pen exists, right? It cannot account for its own existence. So, of course, we could argue how many dependent beings there are. We could argue how many contingent beings there are. But we don't even need to argue that there are multiple contingent beings or that there are multiple dependent beings. We simply could just find one, right? That's one of the beauties of this type of argument, is if there's just anything that exists that is dependent upon or is contingent upon something else for its existence, then there's going to have to be something that exists necessarily for the metaphysical buck to stop. So again, some thinkers like R.C. Sproul uses a version of this argument, this version of a Thomistic type argument, that would say, I think he holds up a piece of chalk, that if this piece of chalk exists and it can't explain its own existence, it doesn't exist simply because it's of what it is. It's dependent upon something else for its existence. It's contingent. Well, if just a piece of chalk exists, in our case, we'll say this pen, if just that exists, then there'll have to be something that will account for existence where the metaphysical book stops. It has to be a necessary, timeless, existing, perfect being in and of itself. Now, having said that, let's just go ahead and say that it's not controversial that some things simply exist, yet they exist due to something else, right? That was a very convoluted way to say, hey, some stuff exists that can't be accounted for by itself. Now, the second premise is if something is a dependent being, then its continued existence must be sustained by something else. Now, this is the controversial premise. It's not necessarily controversial to say that if something is a dependent being, then its existence must be attributed to something else, like, some dude constructed the piece of chalk, right? Formulated the matter, put it into some particular form, put it in a machine, did a bunch of stuff, popped it out of existence. And now it's there. There's the chalk. Now the guy, he passes away. But look, clearly the chalk still exists, even though the cause for the chalk, the particular dude, right, in the factory at that moment, even though he passes away, the chalk is not, though it was contingent upon him, for its existence. It's clearly not now dependent for something else, for this guy, right? This manufacturer. It's not dependent upon him now for its existence, right? So this is the controversial premise. And let's look at it a little further. So if the chalk was dependent upon something for its existence, because again, its own existence can't be explained within its own nature, right? It's not the nature of chalk to exist all by itself, right? It's not the essence of chalk to exist all by itself. In other words, just because it is a piece of chalk doesn't mean that it has to exist. It may exist, it may not exist, right? Now, what about this claim then that if something is dependent, right, if something can account for its own existence simply by virtue of what it is, its essence, if something can account for what it is just because of what it is, the controversial part here is, well, then why should we think that it's still dependent upon something else for its existence then? All right, well, let's examine the chalk thing right a little more depth. Let's say that the guy makes the chalk, right? And he passes away. But think about it. The chalk is still getting existence. It doesn't have existence. It's still getting existence. All right, so stay with me here. What do you mean it's getting existence? Think about it. The chalk is not actualizing itself, right? Think back to that first Aristotelian argument. It's not able to actualize its own existence. It can't will its own existence. What? Wait a minute. What now? You're still losing me. All right. Notice that if the temperature in the room is not within certain parameters, say it's 4,000 degrees and I don't know, whatever the temperature would have to be to disintegrate chalk, right? Or say it's so low that the atoms, can't completely, whatever the temperature ramifications may be for chalk to exist, the chalk is dependent upon the temperature, right? It's dependent upon some other thing outside of itself in order to keep its existence going, right? But notice that it's not also just dependent upon the temperature. It's also dependent upon the molecular structure, right? Well, that whatever it is that composes chalk to exist. So that if something weren't keeping that molecular structure in the precise ramifications that it needs to be for it to be chalk, then it wouldn't. Then the chalk itself would, again, the molecules would separate from one another, or they would crush down so quickly that they wouldn't be, whatever the form it is now, it wouldn't be that. It couldn't be what it is right now if it wasn't dependent upon the gravitational pull, the relation of the atom, the mass, all of these sorts of things. It's also dependent upon the strong and the weak nuclear force, right? Whatever the workings of that has to be. The point simply being that the chalk is still dependent on things right here, right now, that have to be a certain way right here and right now simply for them to exist, right? Now, the problem though is that the temperature, whatever it is, the temperature doesn't just sustain itself, right? Whatever the temperature is in this room, right? It's not sustaining itself at that temperature, right? It's dependent upon these other environmental factors, right? Whatever those, I'm not a meteorologist, but whatever those particular environmental factors, whatever the particular factors would have to be within the climate to keep the temperature at this particular range, right? Within this specific parameter. But again, we can keep kicking this problem back and we're still not going to solve it, because whatever it is that keeps that in particular range, right, that particular range, something else that's going to be dependent upon some other sort of factors, right, that are keeping that in some particular parameter, right? But we can't keep going backwards until we find out that this third premise. And again, it wouldn't be just the temperature. Remember, the chalk, it would be the molecular structure of the chalk itself. It would have to be the form of the chalk. It would have to be all of these other aspects, right? So let's look at the third premise. If a dependent being is sustained by something else, right, and which we know that it is. I mean, we looked at premise 2. It is sustained right now for its existence, right? You, right now, not just the chalk, but you or I, we can't just give ourselves existence, right? Again, if the temperature is not right, if it's 400 degrees, we burn up. If it's negative something below, we can't survive without aid, which means we'd be dependent on something else. But if if the oxygen levels decrease or increase, we would suffocate. All sorts of issues, right? We're not keeping ourselves in existence just because we're human, right? Just because I have the nature of being a human doesn't keep me in existence. I'm being a human. I have existence, but I'm still having to depend on other things for my existence to even still be here right now, right? So this third premise again, if a dependent being is sustained by something else, then either the chain of sustained beings regresses infinitely, or it terminates in an independent being that is not itself sustained, right? So all of these factors, all of the ramifications that have to be in play to keep me in existence right now, or to keep the chalk in existence right now, either that's going to go, well, that's explained by this. Well, that's explained by this. Well, that's causing this. This is causing this. This is causing this. This is causing this. Ad infinitum, right? And so if you're familiar with the Kalam Cosmological Argument, you know that there's a massive problem, right, with saying that a chain of causes can regress infinitely, right? There's all sorts of problems in saying that an actual infinite can exist. One being that if actual infinites exist in reality, right, in concrete as a concrete thing, right, events, whatever else, people, paper, places, whatever, then you have Hilbert's Hotel, all of these absurdities that result, right? But then also, nothing ever actually gets started, right? Because you're dependent upon this for this to begin, but that had to begin. But before that could begin, that had to begin. But before that had to begin, this had to begin. But before this began, this had to begin. But before that began, this had to begin. Ad infinitum. Nothing ever actually gets going, right? Because you can only appeal to the cause in front of it. But before that happens, the prior, right? But that's a linear cause, right? That's not what we're concerned with. So that's not the only difficulty. Remember, we're concerned with a hierarchical set of causes, right? Meaning that in this sense, right, remember, for the chalk to exist right here and right now, it's dependent on something right here, right now being actualized for its existence right now, right? The temperature, which is dependent upon this, which is dependent upon this, which is dependent on this, which is dependent on this, for it to be the temperature right now. So that if we can't, that can't go back ad infinitum, right? Because again, it'd be like saying, if we look at gears, right? If we're spinning the gear, which is spinning this gear, which is spinning this gear, which is spinning this gear, if there's nothing that's spinning the gear right now, say 50,000 gears back, then this gear at the initial onset, right, even it can't be spinning right now. If this one is not actualizing this one, which 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 is not actualizing this one, well, then this one cannot be actualized if there's something somewhere actualizing the entire set, right? You can't continually go back and appeal to the gear before that because the gear before that is not in and of itself. Here's key, listen. The gear, even the gear before that, each gear is not in and of itself actualizing itself, is it? No, it's dependent upon something that's the very first one, the initial gear, that's being actualized, right? To do the whole process, right? So if the chalk exists, right? If the thing, whatever it is, whatever you want to pick, if that thing exists here and now, well, whatever is responsible for its existence here and now is also responsible for its existence to be what it is, the temperature, the structure, whatever. It's dependent on something here and now, but that cause is dependent upon something here and now, right? Which is, again, ad infinitum. So either that chain goes, it regresses infinitely, right? Which it just can't do. Or it's being actualized right here, right now, by something that is actual, that is not potential, right? So here's where we try to put this together. 5. Therefore, the chain of sustained beings must terminate in an independent being that is not itself sustained. Well, wait a minute. Why can't we just say, well, whatever that is, that itself is being sustained by something else? Because if we do that, we've just lost our explanation, right? The metaphysical buck has to stop somewhere, right? Again, if a gear is dependent upon a gear for its actual, right? If this gear has the potential to move, but it can't move by itself, it's dependent upon this gear to move it, right? Well, it's the same problem with this gear. It can't actualize itself, right? It's dependent upon this gear over here to move it, but this gear can't actualize itself. Something has to be actualizing them, not in a linear series, right? Because this gear can't go out of existence and this one still go, right? Because that one was dependent upon this one right here, right now, for it to be able to move right here, right now. But this one was dependent upon the one prior to it, right here, right now. Again, it didn't start the thing going and then it can just go by itself. If this one's not going before it, it just can't go. It's dependent upon the one prior to it right here, right now. So the chalk, right? The tree, you, me, whatever we're made of, right? Whatever we are, we're dependent upon something right here, right now for our existence. But that's exactly the case for each of the causes, the gears that are keeping us in existence, that they're dependent upon something right here, right now. That can't go on ad infinitum. Otherwise, we have zero explanation as to how we can have any sort of potential thing that doesn't have to exist, but is in fact getting existence somewhere. We have zero explanation as to how this is happening, right? Now, notice that this thing's essence, right? This is where we talk about, let's talk about Phaser's, how he concentrated on the essence-existence distinction. Notice that the chalk, its essence, whatever it is, when we talk about the nature or essence of something, that just means what it is, right? We're giving some sort of dictionary type definition of what a thing is. Notice that just because a thing, what it is, doesn't mean that it has to exist, right? Just because we know what chalk is, doesn't mean that chalk has to exist. In fact, we know that at some point in time, right, at least in however far back we need to go, that there just wasn't something like chalk, right, manufactured chalk or whatever, and possibly even chalk at all if we go back within the time frame of the universe appropriately. We definitely know that there weren't humans at some point, right? So just the fact that we know what a human is, what humanness is, it doesn't follow that humans must exist simply because of what they are, right? Now, that just seems to be the case for all of the things of our immediate experience, that they're contingent, that they're dependent. And even when we know what they are, their essence, it doesn't entail that just because we know what they are, that means that they must exist. Now, if the explanation of all of these particular contingent dependent things, if it also doesn't entail that it must exist, well, then its explanation has to be found outside of itself, right? But if its explanation is found outside of itself, well, then we haven't solved the problem. Again, we're just back to square one. So metaphysically, there has to be something that its essence just is existence. You are a human being. Your essence is humanity, right? Or humanness. But your essence is not existence, right? You're a human, but you may exist, you may not exist. You're getting your existence. But there has to be something of which its very essence just is to exist. This is mind-blowing to us, obviously, metaphysically, philosophically. This is mind-blowing to us. Something that just, because of what it is, means it just is existence. Yet, metaphysically, this is the only way that we can solve this problem of infinite regress. And it's the only way that we can explain why, if things that can't explain their own existence in and of themselves, why they're dependent upon something right now outside of themselves for their existence, why this would have to terminate, this would have to end in something that is not, that can't be explained outside of itself, right? It would have to be a purely actualized, necessarily existing, perfect, right? Because if it wasn't perfect, then that would just mean there's something that it lacks, some potentiality, right? But if there's some potentiality that it lacks, that's just another way to say that it's not necessary. But if it's not necessary, that means that it could exist or it could not exist, right? That means it's dependent. But again, if it's dependent, it just can't be the explanation, right? It just can't be the explanation for itself if it, by definition, is dependent, right? Because if it's dependent, that's just to say that something has to actualize it, right? If it's dependent. So there has to be something that's independent, something that's necessary, something that's metaphysically necessary, something that just what it is means that it is also, or also entails that it is, right? Now, again, this fits perfectly with what we would see in, say, something like the Judeo-Christian concept of God, right? The very name of God is just as I am, right? Which could easily be translated as I is, I be, I am, I exist, I am, right? There's no this property, which again, this goes back to the whole issue of divine simplicity, right? So Phaser is arguing that just because something's essence is that, whatever it is, doesn't mean that it is. In order to get around this metaphysical problem of, well, how do we explain the existence of anything right here, right now, when that thing can't even account for its own existence? Well, there has to be metaphysically something that its very essence just is to exist. And that would be what we would call God, right? Now, let us look at something like this, a logical breakdown of categories by Geisler, right? And again, Sproul even, he does something similar here too, even with his whole chalk thing there. And I kind of like this. This may help you out a little bit too. And some of this may be so foreign and so new to you that you're just having to stop, the lecture and say, wait, I'm going to have to go through all this again before we even get to this. But this may help you. So get through this first, and then let's look at the argument in light of, in retrospect, right, after looking at this. Geisler would say something like this. He would say, all of that which exists contingently can be accounted for by an appeal to one of three logically possible options. So one of the reasons we love logic, right, is it helps us to break down all sorts of topics and problems in a way that no matter how we might answer something, they can fit into a couple different logical categories, right? So what are these logically possible options for something that exists contingently, right? Scroll down. That which is responsible for the cause of all that which is contingent, right? And again, you can even just use one example. You can use just that piece of chalk or just this particular pen here. That which is responsible, let's just do the pen. That which is responsible or the cause of all that which is contingent of this pen, right? Let's just say this pen, that which is responsible for the cause of this pen, which is ultimately responsible for this, is either a self-caused cause, right? Whatever option, whatever theory you want to pick out, it's going to fall into one of these categories here. It's going to either be a self-caused cause, right? It's either going to be an infinite regress of causes, or it's going to be an uncaused cause. Again, logically speaking, there's just no other option, right? Of course, I'm not even entertaining the idea that, well, maybe the cause is uncaused out of nothing. Maybe it's just it popped into existence without a cause, right? I mean, that's just metaphysically absurd. I mean, if you want, you can go look at William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, where he almost out of frustration and derision defends the premise that you just can't have something caused out of nothing. I mean, if you think of that for more than 5 seconds, you realize that's just metaphysically absurd. Out of nothing, nothing comes, right? Ex nihilo nihilo fit, right, as they say in Latin there. So we're not even going to look at that. I mean, it's almost just not even worth the time. I mean, all right, look, I'll give you one example. If things come uncaused into existence out of nothing, then we have no explanation as to why just anything and everything doesn't pop into existence, right? Now, I've heard some internet atheist say something like, well, yeah, but then it wouldn't be out of nothing because we have stuff, and so we don't know. Well, that just completely now it's not even falsifiable, right? And even still, that's not a better option. That's a worse option, because now you can explain why something, if we do have something, why things can't pop into existence out of something, because you have something, right? It's just, again, forget it. It's crazy. Let's get back to these categories. You would either have a self-caused cause that's going to be the explanation of the ultimate explanation of all contingent things, or in this case, the pen. It would either be an infinite regress of causes, or it would be an uncaused cause. Now, let's look at some of the problems of these. We know that whatever it is that is going to account for all things, right? All contingent things, all things that exist but don't exist necessarily. The ultimate explanation for this can't be a self-caused cause. Why? Well, because we know that a self-caused cause ends up being logically incoherent. There's been a couple different philosophers that have pointed this out. Some would say, I think Geisler even attributes this to Sartre, but really, I mean, it goes even further back than he. But we know that a self-caused cause is a logical contradiction. Because in order to cause yourself to exist, or whatever it is that exists, in order to cause its own existence, it has to exist prior to existence in order to cause its existence. But if it causes itself to exist in some sense, it has to exist in some sense to cause itself to exist, right? But if it exists in some sense in order to cause itself to exist, then it can't cause itself to exist because it already exists in some sense, right? So again, that seems to be just logically and metaphysically absurd. That you can't cause yourself to exist, because if you cause yourself to exist, that you have to exist in some sense to cause yourself to exist. But if you cause yourself to exist, then you can't say that you cause yourself to exist because you already existed, right? Again, just a philosophical train wreck. Now, the next would be the infinite regress of causes. Now, we've already looked at that, why that would be metaphysically impossible, right? Now, some might argue that it's logically possible to have an infinite regress of causes in a linear fashion, right? Well, this can be explained by this, which can be explained by this, which can be explained by this. That's problematic if we look at the difficulties that are revealed in, say, Hilbert's Hotel, right? All the absurdities that seem to result if we actually posit a real, concrete, existing set of infinites, right? Actual infinites. And it seems to be metaphysically impossible when we talk about in a linear fashion that, well, right, but if this begins to exist, like say, whatever's happening right now, if this begins to exist, that can only be accounted for by a prior cause, which can only be accounted for by a prior cause. And we go back 60 billion causes, well, that 60 billionth cause can only be accounted for by the cause in front of it, which could, again, you just keep kicking the can down the road, right? So that seems to be metaphysically impossible for a linear set. But remember, these arguments, we're not talking about a linear set of causes. We're talking about a hierarchical set of causes, right? Causal series per se. So it's more substantial to try to posit that something can be accounted for in an infinite regress in a causal series, a hierarchical causal series, because literally you can't account for this latest, say this last gear turning. You can't account for the last gear by simply appealing to this gear, because The explanation is literally, remember this, the explanation is not in the gear previous to it, remember? Because its essence, that it is a gear, is not enough to account for its existence. The fact that it's spinning is not accounted for just because it's a gear, right? Because remember, in the hierarchical series of causes, the only thing that it can account for the existence of any of the causes within the causal chain is something that its very essence just is to exist in and of itself. You see why this is more difficult. You really can't try to claim or try to appeal to an infinite regressive causes like Bertrand Russell tried to do in his argument with Frederick Copleston, right? You really can't appeal to an infinite regressive causes in a hierarchical series. Again, think of the chains. If this chain is being suspended by this chain, which is being suspended by this chain, if you take out any of the links, they all fall together. You can't take out one chain and say, well, that was the cause of the suspension of the rest of the chain, and then expect the chain to still hang in midair. It won't happen, right? It's even more difficult when you try to appeal to that type of cause, hierarchical cause, and this is exactly what that kind of argument is, right? Because you may be asking, well, wait a minute, how do we know that, say, the chalk or the human being, how do we know that it does exist because of hierarchical set? Well, again, go back to, I think, the third premise. What was the third premise there? Yeah. So you go back to that, and again, well, we know that there's at least something. You and I, right? You and I are dependent upon other things right now in the hierarchical sense. Not just that we were dependent upon our parents for our existence. We were, sure we were. We'll grant that, absolutely. In fact, we would. If you think you can defend the Kalam cosmological argument, then you're willing to grant those notions. I'm willing to grant them. But it's true that if we also are dependent on something else outside of our existence right here and right now, just for us to exist, which we also are, well, then now we run into this problem of having to have the hierarchical explanation for our existence, right? Not just the linear, but also the fact that we exist right here, right now, or that the pen exists right here and right now, and it's dependent upon something outside of itself, not just its maker, the manufacturer dude, right? But it's dependent on other factors right now just for this to stay in existence right here and right now. If that were the only thing that would get us to God, right? If I or you are the only thing that exists and we still need something for our existence right here and right now, then that would get us to God because the metaphysical buck has to stop somewhere, right? So our last option then is an uncaused cause. There has to be something that exists in and of itself, whose essence just is existence. It just does exist. It just actualizes all other potentialities to an actual state that it itself cannot be actualized. It itself must be necessary. It itself must be perfect. It itself must lack no potentialities. Because again, all of those things just imply differences or one state of affairs that could be. But if there's a state of affairs that it could be, that it is not now, then that just means that it's not necessary. It could be this, it could be this, right? But if it's not necessary, then it can't have its own explanation. It can't have the explanation of its existence in and of itself, right? And if it doesn't have the explanation for its existence in and of itself, if its own act of being is not just what it means for it to be, well, then you're just going to have to kick the can back again. You're on slap dab right into the infinite regressive causes, right, which gets you nowhere. Now, again, by the way, again, what we just said was to note the implications of the nature of the attributes of this uncaused cause. So again, like we said, we're not going to talk about in this course the nature or attributes of God, even though it's normally in a philosophy of religion course, because we already are, right? Because if these classical arguments work, then you're already getting into the nature and the attributes of God. Namely, this time, the nature of God would have to be just that God is, right? God just is. His essence is to exist, right? The attribute would have to be necessary, perfect, pure actuality, purely one, right? Again, which just rules out all of these Greek and Roman mythological demigods. Zeus doesn't fit this bill, right? Hermes doesn't fit this bill, right? Thor, Odin, all of these popular internet atheist slogans. Well, what kind of God would exist? We still wouldn't know. Well, no, By definition, all of those would be ruled out simply by what this type of God would have to be metaphysically, right? When we talk about nature, essence, necessary existence, all of these sorts of things, right? Oh, awesome. And we just, I didn't even know we were on this slide about the necessary existence, no potentiality, purely actualized, which again is just what Thomas would say famously. This is what he concludes these arguments with, which is just what we mean by God, right? Now, we could go again even into more depth, right, with these classical arguments, specifically this Thomistic version. And I want you to. These are just really, really, really interesting arguments. Once you chew on these for a while, once you start to just digest this stuff. Again, I'm not knocking popular apologetics as they are now. I think it's very interesting. I think they're very strong, very robust, very defensible arguments that are great for arguing the existence of God. But don't neglect some of this good old school, right, stuff, to say it very crudely there. Let's don't neglect these. This is some good stuff that we can really, really ponder over. It's intellectually stimulating, right? One of the positives about the popular arguments is they aren't necessarily as abstract, philosophical, in depth. Again, even though they're strong, even though they're robust. But if you just enjoy philosophy, just maybe you're wired that way, maybe that's how you are. These are arguments that you can enjoy just as a philosopher, that you can really sink your philosophical teeth into, right? Really ponder some of these things, really get down into. So do that. Go check out, find Sproul's version of this argument. I enjoy it. I like that argument too. Again, basically this argument, just a kind of a different formulation of it. Go look at Geisler's, in our text. Look at Timothy Sowell's. Look at that. Look at Phaser's. Some of those other books. Well, honestly, you've got enough on your plate, right? Just with our course and our text here, but whenever you just find the time, right, that you can do this stuff for enjoyment, check these out, right? Again, there's more here. Now, we're supposed to look at the rationalist argument. Again, I'm trying to fly through these. I know I've got a lot more video lectures than I normally would. And then we're going to try to roughshod run through some of the atheistic arguments in philosophy and religion. Until that's done, I hope you guys enjoyed this Thomistic argument, arguments, right? And see you next lecture. Have a good one, guys.